You have now heard both of my colleagues explain the negative side's arguments as to why we believe that NASA should not receive any more funding for the fiscal year 2013. I will now address some of the points brought up by the affirmative. First, the affirmative side has stated that NASA should be given more money to fund trips to space. I'm sure we would all agree that another voyage to the moon, or Mars even, would be great. But since the last Apollo mission in the 1970s, NASA's priorities have mostly remained within the Earth's atmosphere. Recently, it was reported that the White House ordered NASA to focus its research on climate change rather than space travel. From an article in Opposing Viewpoints by George Landreth, quote, Obama's NASA administrator, Charles Bolden, revealed that one of President Obama's primary missions for NASA was to reach out to the Muslim world, to help Islamic nations feel good about their contributions and accomplishments in the scientific arena. In other words, NASA would become an international feel-good organization, end quote. This is the direction that NASA is heading. Not to the moon, not to Mars. NASA will become an international feel-good organization for our government. The problem is not in NASA's funding. NASA is receiving funding, but it's not going where my opponents and most of the country are probably expecting. There are plenty of other government organizations that are also receiving funding for things like climate change research, international relations, and other inventive projects, or to invent new technologies, such as the computer mouse. Why should NASA receive any more funding to do the same things? Before we give NASA any more funding, we need to figure out its priorities. And if space travel isn't reasonable in our current economic situation, perhaps funding should be cut even more. Another point that was brought up by the affirmative side is that NASA is not receiving proper funding from our government, and its funding has been slowly decreasing. My opponent Emily stated that if funding continues to decrease, NASA will eventually disappear, but this is not necessarily true. Even if NASA does not receive any government funding, they can still receive funding through other means, such as private investors. My opponents painted a great picture of the successes that NASA has had and the pride it has created. One thing they emphasized was all of NASA's successful missions. They did not, however, mention all of its failures. Over the years, NASA's budget has changed, depending on what the public views of it are. As Abraham Lincoln said, with public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. In the past, and still today, public interest has had a huge impact on NASA's budget. The budget and public interest was the highest in the 60s, and then dropped after the Apollo 13 incident in the early 70s, where what seemed like a routine trip to the moon became a struggle for survival. Thankfully, the entire crew made it home safely, but it was close. It dropped even more in 2003 Columbia crash. People began to lose faith in NASA. NASA was created to advance America and give Americans pride in their country, in a time where we desperately needed it. But today, there are other things that are a priority over NASA: creating jobs, education, and the national debt. These are things we should be focusing on. NASA's budget is fine the way it is now, and increasing it by $1 billion will not make a huge difference. We are not asking to cut NASA's budget completely, but to keep it as it is. This is why the negative side rejects the proposal to increase NASA's funding for the fiscal year 2013. Thank you.
So far, my colleagues have done a good job at talking about how NASA's research is important to our education and our future. Meanwhile, my opponents have argued about how NASA's budget shouldn't be increased or even decreased so America has more money to use on other things, like its ginormous national debt. I don't think the Department of Defense's budget should be cut too much to compensate for the money being used by NASA, but don't think the NASA budget should be cut either. It's more of the other things the federal budget is being used on that should be cut over either of those, because defense and our exploration in technology is very important. So it, okay. The only thing we can get out of NASA isn't just space exploration. For example, besides some of the things that my colleagues have previously stated, some of the spin-offs that NASA has invented are LED lights, which a handheld high-intensity LED unit, the Warp 10, is being used by the Department of Defense and the U.S. Navy to aid soldiers with minor wounds and pain. Or there's also firefighting equipment, which most notably there's the breathing apparatus, which, well, so they don't, die from fumes or anything. There's a lot of other things I could go through, but, well, most of them help us in our daily lives. Some of NASA's other inventions that I wanted to mention were artificial limbs and landmine removal, but I'm taking into concern the Warp 10 and landmine removal because they both help out us, like, in the military, because landmines usually kill people, Okay. Increasing the NASA budget would also create more jobs in addition to slowly, and maybe not slowly, but advancing our technology. NASA's budget is 18 billion, which is about half of 1% of the federal budget. But this isn't even enough because the mission to Mars was canceled due to the lack of budget. While NASA's budget is only 18 billion, there have been previous events, I guess, where money has been wasted. Like in April 2003, this continued for a little more than a year. A total of $12 billion of U.S. currency was shipped from the Federal Reserve to Iraq, and about 19 billion of it was unaccounted for. That's about half the NASA budget, which we should be looking or trying to recover that money. The country also already spends vast sums of money on war and defense, which it should also be investing on the future of its people and humanity in general, which is, well, NASA inventing new technology. That's what I mean. It should be invested in them. Okay. This is about all I have.
Okay, can I start? Yeah, right. NASA's been around since 1958, and since then our economy has been struggling. The more money we spend on space, our nation's debt will increase dramatically. We cannot spend more money on something outrageous. Billions of dollars have already been lost by many failures that NASA has been accounted for. A couple years back, $429 million rocket blew up, destroying a $40 million satellite. Just like that, all that money gone. Was it even worth it? Sending that much equipment up into space just to learn is not practical. I would rather use that money on new textbooks for schools or helpful no, we want to waste it all on a rocket to learn that there's another planet in a galaxy far, far away, and we'll never plan on seeing or visiting it. But 18.7 billion is the proposed amount that is funded towards NASA. That's malarkey. The current amount of funding that is given to NASA is $17.7 billion, and that's more than enough money that they need. Schools are the beginning of every single student's future, and hopefully the environment of that school is pretty good. $1 billion can be used to help schools all around the country, even schools that can obtain the next generation of people to run our country. And if they're not properly taught, then how are they supposed to lead our country to success? Clearly, $1 billion can be used to help our fellow students' education rather than bring a rock from the moon to Earth. But no, wait, you guys would love to waste that money on something practical such as rocks. Instead of spending that money on a satellite worth over $40 million, we could be helping out our nation's education system. $40 million could build a school, hire great educators, and supply the schools with supplies, books, and even a library. Our district's budget currently right now is around $8 million. We could use that money on a lot of nice things for this school to help learning easier for everyone, and even more schools around New England. If we took that $18 billion and gave it to NASA, nothing good would happen. With that money, we could help 2,375 schools in this nation pay off their budget so that they can make learning easier. So why spend the money on something to learn about when we can make the learning a lot easier? It would also ease our tax burden. Taxes would increase a lot higher because of this increased funding. Now, Emily said that the Department of Defense is being funded a lot is too much. Times are rough currently. There are a lot of people in this world that really hate our country. So without a well-funded department, we could risk our national security. So the economy can't fund NASA. The economy shouldn't even fund NASA at all. They don't really go into space that much anymore. So our country's debt is increasing rapidly, about $1 million a day. So why do you think we should spend $18.7 billion on space exploration? I forgot who said it, but we use NASA has a way of seeing like ice craters melt or something like that. But I think that's kind of nutty because we can just use a helicopter or plane to take an aerial photo instead. And something about landmines. I'm not exactly sure why that was brought up, but landmines are usually detected by a knife manually or a metal detector. Not really space or anything. That's all I got. So, yeah.